Hello and welcome to Reader 2 Standing By, Episode 4. I'm Wedge.
And I go by Wraith14, and I remembered to say it this time.
And we are so happy to have you join us in our journey through the X-Wing series of Star Wars books, comics, and video games from the old expanded universe. This month, we're covering the second book in the Wraith Squadron trilogy of the X-Wing series, Iron Fist by Aaron Allston. We decided to do it in this month, in June, because of the Essential Legends re-release of the book in paperback and the new unabridged audiobook read by Marc Thompson. We do want to say this is a spoiler podcast, so spoiler alert for everything we've covered so far, so Wraith Squadron and the X-Wing comics, and of course, the entire book of Iron Fist that we'll be reading today. So if you have not read Iron Fist yet, please go and do so. You will enjoy it. Firstly, let's start with our context for this month's novel. Out of Universe, Iron Fist was published on July 6th, 1998, making it about to turn 26 years old as we release this episode at the end of June. Wraith Squadron was published in February of the same years, 5 months before, and Solo Command followed in February of 1999, which is 7 months later. Roughly 3 books in the span of a year. It's a slower tempo than the 4 books of Rogue Squadron, which were released in the year of 1996 to 1997. But 5 to 7 months isn't really that far apart in books, in release gaps. As we talked about last episode, the X-Wing Rogue Squadron comics were still publishing at this time, and in July, the month that Iron Fist published, the ending of the penultimate arc, Masquerade, was released, as well as the Rogue Squadron handbook that we also covered last month. It's very clear that Aaron Allston was reading these X-Wing Rogue Squadron comics as he was writing, because Baron Fell and his history with the Rogues and with Wedge particularly are a huge part of Wedge's arc in this story. In terms of the novels, the Han Solo trilogy by A.C. Crispin wrapped up in March of 1999. No, it was 98. Yeah, 1998. The X-Wing adjacent novel, I, Jedi by Mike Stackpole, dropped in May. The first 2 books in the Bounty Hunter Wars trilogy dropped in this year. And Vision of the Future was released as the series finale of the Bantam era of publishing for Star Wars, for a total of 7 adult novels released in 1998. That's a lot of adult novels. But interestingly, I didn't read most of these novels. I, of course, read I, Jedi and Vision of the Future, although I don't know if I read I, Jedi before Vision of the Future. I didn't read the Han Solo trilogy or the Bounty Hunter Wars at this time. There was a real sense of what I call finishing up and filling in the gaps from the years of 1996 to 1999. Whereas the first several years of the expanded universe from 1991 to 1995 kind of pushed the entire timeline from Truce at Bakura, which is right after Return of the Jedi, all the way to the Corellian trilogy, which is just 1 year before The Hand of Thrawn. The only book that went further in the timeline in 1996 to 1999 was Vision of the Future and Spectre of the Past, the Hand of Thrawn duology. And all the other books, and there were a lot of books published, were either like the X-Wing books or the Han Solo books, which are technically all prequels. And that's why I call it kind of the filling in the gaps portion of the Bantam timeline. Is there anything that you remember about, that you think about this span of time when Iron Fist was published?
I hadn't realized that. Let's see. Yeah, Vision of the Future. I didn't realize that was published before Solo Command.
Yes.
Which kind of, that stood out. As someone who I think read them chronologically, because I wasn't old enough for going around right as they were published, I hadn't really thought about that and the timeline stuff too much of publishing order. There's still we'll talk about next book, or not actually next podcast. Doesn't come out as an unabridged audiobook until November. But for Solo Command, the next one in the X-Wing series, there's an interesting lineup between that and Vision of the Future.
Yep.
That had me thinking about.
Well, let us move to our mission report summarizing the story of Iron Fist. Why don't you take away the first part of our story?
Sure. So it starts off in kind of a symmetrical way where you have two different people at different chapters apart getting attacked by a cyborg who made no pretense of being fully human and striking somebody else over the head with a bottle and are kicking off a big fight. First time is somebody sent by Zinj to attack the Wraiths when they're out on the town. Start off the book, but the Wraiths being a ground unit, they managed to fend that off. Military police show up, and Face, with his skill of where are people from based on how they walk, realized these are not the real military police. So then Todd Fanon, with his doctor's skill of scalpels, kills one of them, kicks off a fight. Most of them die. Most of the bad guys, that is, not the Wraiths, they come out relatively unscathed. But then there's a funny bit after they've cleared everything up with Command where the Wraiths pull the same scheme on, and this part is where my memory of just listening to it from the audiobook gets a little foggy. I think they're on an Imperial world, and Fanon, posing as the cyborg because he is one, clubs one of their own guys.
Clubs Kel.
Yeah, he clubs Kel, that's who I thought it was, over the head with a fake bottle. But then that kicks off a bar fight where Kel gets hit in the head with a real bottle, I think. Or maybe it's Kel, maybe it was Runt. Runt might not make as much sense since he's an Imperial. Feel free to correct me. But anyway, they basically just is the Wraiths pull the same scheme of, here comes the military police to settle down the fight, except it's us this time, and they're looking to steal. Is that how they're stealing the TIE fighters, or does that come later?
It's part of their plan to steal the TIE fighters because they're getting the information from the pilots. So they get like IDs and stuff from the pilots, and they're able to get a skimmer to the base where the TIE fighters are stored.
Okay, the Wraiths, between all three books, they do a lot of these kind of heist missions where they're trying to steal fighters or sneak their way into an Imperial base, so it kind of runs together. And I don't want to say the wrong thing. Like, I know there's something that comes up in Solo Command where they're doing something really similar to this. And I'm like, definitely don't want to mention that because it involves somebody new. So do you want to get into the new people now?
Well, after, just before they start their mission, where they basically use the same tactic that Zinj used on the Imperial world of Halmad, we get our replacement race. So remember, last book, we lost 3 pilots. We lost Jesmin and Phelan and Grinder. This time, we get 3 replacement pilots and a surprise extra. So our 3 replacements are Shala Nelprin, Kasten Dawn, and Dia Pasik. So why don't you run through who those guys are?
Yeah, so Kasten, he's an interesting case, is from Coruscant, a rebel there, but as we soon find out, doesn't get along with just about any non-humans. Originally, he's assigned a bunk with Runt and goes to Wedge to complain that Runt smells, and it's keeping Castan from being able to sleep at night. So Wedge, kind of using his command techniques, basically kind of ignores Castan originally arriving because he's not identifying himself as Flight Officer Dawn. Wedge has noticed his lack of military bearing, kind of calls him out on it in a less direct way at that point. Then tests him by saying, well, if you don't like being in a room with Runt, why don't I put you in with Vort, Piggy, the Gamorrean? And even though he's not been around Piggy, that immediately has Castan looking even more displeased, and Wedge is like, yep, got you. But that funny anecdote aside, it's interesting to see a character who's a rebel but has the same, having been from Coruscant, Imperial prejudices about the non-humans, which we'll return to later. As far as Castan goes, he's also their slicer, and as we find out in his kind of why I signed up to do this moment, had been one of the people projecting the images and video of the Death Star getting blown up while he was on Coruscant, and that kicked off the celebrations you see at the end of the Return of the Jedi. What is it? Special edition?
Yep.
The re-release one where they edited and added scenes in. And as you find out, Allston added that right as soon as everybody started celebrating, stormtroopers showed up and shot them.
Yeah.
So Castan feels guilty about having, set the conditions for that, and is angry at the Empire, and that's his motivation for wanting to be in with the New Republic and becoming a pilot, because he sees Zinj as being a repeat of the stormtroopers who did that.
And he's not wrong. Zinj is violent, brutal, and greedy. And I think it's really cool because a lot of people, it is something that you have to think about. And I like that Allston made it this sort of tragic thing. Like, why would people on the Imperial throne world celebrate the downfall of the government that they're still under? And this explains it in a very brutal way. And I have to say, this is something that I get very upset about with the novel Aftermath by Chuck Wendig, because that opens with basically this exact same scene, and the exact same thing happens, and there's no additional personality or twist or anything. So it feels to me like Wendig just stole what Allston did so poignantly and tragically in this story of Castan.
Yeah, I didn't want to repeat the whole scene, but he mentions that, he was down there and a mother with her child got shot right in front of him, and he had to grab the kid to save the kid from the stampede that resulted. So yeah, that's Castan's story. Shala Nelprin is the daughter of a former Old Republic.
Well, we don't know that yet.
We don't?
Nope, that's Solar Command.
You'll find out that she comes from a family that's skilled in intelligence and hand-to-hand combat. As it turns out, when Kel was in the Commandos, pre-Wraith Squadron, he was trained by Shala's older sister. And so when Shala's first introduced as Nelprin, he is immediately starts pretending to hit his head against the wall because he realizes she can beat them up. But yeah, you get kind of let the cat out of the bag that her family's got an intelligence pass, but you see the signs of that here. I mean,
Oh, absolutely.
You get more detail in Solo Command about her father being an intelligence operative in the past, but here she definitely like thinks about, what would my dad say to do, or what were his lessons. So he trained her to some level. It just blends together for me, having read both. What of that is from Iron Fist versus Solo Command. And then Dia has kind of a somewhat stereotypical Twi'lek background of having been enslaved.
She's basically Ula if Ula became a pilot and killed Jabba.
Yeah, because it's revealed she got talked pilot of working for the guy that essentially like her master, owner, what have you, to train her in how to fly. I don't know if they say the exact ship, but something like a headhunter, a civilian armed fighter, and then stole it, locked the shields down for the ship she'd been held on, and blew it up before leaving for the New Republic. So she comes off at the beginning with a pretty bloodthirsty attitude.
Yeah, and so Dia and Shala are both relatively short ladies. Shala is black and short-haired and compulsively exercises, which is how she's able to, in my opinion, plausibly beat a bunch of people much bigger than she is. Although this was kind of a trope in the late 90s. This was after the start of the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer, before obviously Firefly. But there was kind of a Wave Fu martial arts thing in the late 90s. And I think that participated in Allston's imagination as he was creating Shala. And then, of course, Caston is this tall, blonde hacker dude. I've always thought that he should be a hick, but Marc Thompson, I think, wisely made him Cockney, which is a lower-class British dialect, which makes sense given that Coruscant is usually thought of as like London or the city world of the English.
Yeah. And yeah, if you're wondering, Shala, there's some Legends art of her, Legends era, a couple images, I think, and she is also on the Essential Legends collection cover for Solo Command, which isn't out yet, but the cover art has been revealed. The Iron Fist one is
Tyria and Peggy.
Yeah, which personally I think might have. Well, I think Shala and Piggy might have worked better for Iron Fist myself, but that's.
I agree completely. Shala has a lot more to do in this book, and Tyria doesn't have a ton to do either in this book or the next book, but she definitely has more to do in the next book than this book.
Tyria had the most to do in Wraith Squadron, so I would have gone.
Yeah. But then we couldn't have Jesmine because she's
True.
only in that book.
And I've heard there's a theme of man and a woman on
we
each
had
of the
a conversation,
and human and alien.
Yeah, we had a conversation.
I don't know if that part's intended. Like the man
no, it was intended because we had a conversation with Tom, the editor at Random House Worlds, who oversees the Essential Legends as well as the current Star Wars line, and he said that the original Rogue Squadron books, they just had one figure per book, but the Wraith books, they wanted to highlight the ensemble nature by having two, and they wanted to highlight just the variety of characters by having a male and a female and a human and an alien on each book. So that was specifically the thing they gave to the artist Diwali, and Diwali chose from the images that they gave him of the different race and put them together using that basically algorithm.
I had a list somewhere of how I would have done it, but now I can't quite remember who I said for Wraith Squadron, even within that. Oh well.
Well, we could do
Maybe
Kel
it wasn't. It didn't include the human. alien part. Kel and Jesmond would make sense.
Kel and Jesma in Wraith Squadron, and then, let me think. Shala and Piggy, I think, actually is a pretty decent combination for the second book. And then it's hard because, wait, no, actually, no, Dia. That'd be tricky because Dia actually would be good on Iron Fist, but what human male would you do? Maybe Face?
Yeah,
Face and Dia?
I'm thinking Face.
And then we do Lara and Piggy for the third book.
That was probably it. Yeah.
Yeah, that would make sense. But I'm not upset about the way they did it. I just feel like it's kind of random if you know what's going on in the books. But speaking of Lara, introduce us to our fourth new character.
So she comes up because at the end of Wraith Squadron, the novel, she creates she's already pretty wisely, even while she's back aboard Implacable, built up this false identity of Lara Naso, just in case being in with Tridget doesn't work out. And so as soon as Implacable goes down and everyone evacuates, which is something she'd made sure would happen by giving the order that she wasn't authorized to give, she presents herself to the New Republic as having been Tridget's captive aboard Implacable, and no one really knew about her because with what Tridget was doing, he kept her in his quarters all the time. And so her intent as Lara Naso is just to use that cover identity to avoid New Republic prison, especially since if they know she's Gara Pedophile, who took down Talon Squadron by posing as a member of the New Republic military, she'd get the death penalty. So she didn't plan to be Lara Naso for any good amount of time, but then she gets pulled into a scheme. And Lara Naso, by the way, is set up as having been an actual person who was killed when Implacable bombarded this farm world. And so that's her cover story, is that she was taken captive instead during that. And before she can really get...
well, let's save that part and move back to our pirate section.
Right. I was going to talk about what Face does with Repness and Lara's role in that, which is kind of removed from the pirates part.
I don't think it's that important. I think we can move to the pirates now.
Oh, okay. The gist is Lara comes into Wraith Squadron, I'll just say in a sentence, having, at the behest of Face and Fanan, taken down a corrupt guy in the New Republic Training Academy.
Oh, no, I'm going to go through that as part of Lara's plot. So
okay, sorry.
We're just going to move through Face's plot in the pirates.
But yeah, Lara is really Gara Pedophile, and she's
also small. I think
there as someone who is eventually becomes a pilot with the Wraiths. When you mentioned the new characters, I was thinking of them as the 4 new Wraiths and how they got to be that. But I guess that kind of got ahead of things. So anyway, the Hawk Bats get set up because they think Zinj wants to hire pirates. Sorry, I kind of took over that bit of Lara's plot in the middle. But yeah, so the Hawk Bats, their job is to get in with Zinj as pirates, but they gotta build up that cover identity and get their own starfighters stolen from the Imperials and start attacking worlds, specifically this one Hamad that's secretly, I think, under his protection, so that eventually he'll step in and make them an offer they can't refuse to work for him. And so we get some funny bits like them robbing a bank with starfighters and repeatedly stealing from the same cargo ship as it, they steal from it on the way out of the system. Then they figured out what it's going to do next and show up again to annoy the leader and take his goods. And in the audiobook, it's really funny because the voice that Thompson uses for Face as General Kargan of the Hawkbat Independent Space Force is very over the top. Pirate.
Yeah, it's very much the classic pirate voice. If you've ever watched like the old Treasure Island movies or anything, it sounds exactly like that. And I think hilariously is the same voice he uses for Captain Zothip in the Hand of Thrawn books. And I think it's similar to what he does for Booster.
Both of whom are either pirates or somewhat
Pirates adjacent.
Yeah. So what we have listed in the notes as the double play is a somewhat disastrous mission where they have indeed gotten Zinj's attention, so much so that he shows up in the Iron Fist, his Super Star Destroyer, which they have no chance of defeating, and they get ambushed. The ground part is a little foggy for me, but they managed to get away.
Well, the reason I called it double play is originally the mission was to blow up 2 different air bases.
That's right.
And so one team was going to blow up from the sky with their TIE fighters, and the other team was going to steal a shuttle, a fuel tanker, and crash that into the other base and blow it up.
Yeah. So I mainly remember kind of the how things went wrong part, not the original part. So Iron Fist shows up and has the shuttle locked in the tractor beam, but they've managed to blow up what they were going to use as the explosive by detaching it, and Mendonos essentially snipes it.
They modify his rifle.
Modified
not
rifle.
A laser, but like an electromagnetic pulse, and that sets off the explosive because they're being jammed. The reason the reason they can't transfer, that they're able to use the plasma electromagnetic pulse to set off the bomb in the Iron Fist's main hangar, which does some damage, but sadly not quite enough to blow up the ship.
Right. It's sort of like a Covert Shroud gambit in the Thrawn trilogy, if you've read those.
Classic. Nice reference.
So then more toward the ground, the Hawkbat pilots who are in a mix of TIE fighters and interceptors.
Yeah, they have 5 interceptors and I think 2 TIE fighters. Maybe only 1. So it's like 6 pilots.
Right, and this is kind of what you see on the cover.
The original cover by Paul.
The original cover, yes.
Let me see if I can pull that up.
Aside from the fact that the Imperial base is like a carbon copy of the one on Endor in Return of the Jedi. But what happens there, essentially, most of them get away. Face almost, I think it's here, slips up and says, "May the Force be with you," but then corrects himself to, "May we drink from the skulls of our enemies tonight," a much more pirate exclamation. And in the course of the battle, Ton Fanon, the Doctor, and there it is.
So you see here we've got our interceptors and our TIE fighters attacking the Return of the Jedi platform. And I think Allston, it's funny, I think Allston either collaborated with Ewell, like gave him a description, or he gave an idea to Ewell. Ewell painted this, and then Allston was able to alter the scene so it fit more perfectly with the details.
Yeah, there's a lot of good synchronicity between the original Wraith Squadron trilogy covers and what's happening in the books. because it's specific moments like that, and you can recognize them. But in the course of the battle, Town Fanon's tide goes down, and he can't eject. He's got no shields. Face orders everyone, and I should mention at this point, since he's playing General Kargan, Face orders everyone else to withdraw, but he goes back and tries to find Fanon, and Fanon is dying of his wounds, as we see in this image, which is from a list called Top 20 Moments of the EU that had been put together fairly late in the course of the EU. And so
I don't know. It was about 2004, so it's not that late.
Okay, not that late. I couldn't remember the exact year, but I knew it was late enough that it included a moment from NJO, several moments from NJO, which are in the 1999 to early 2000s era. Not 100% on the years there.
1999 to 2003.
Right. I started in 99. Didn't know how long it took for them to finish it. But anyway,
and this art, by the way, is by Joe Caroni, who I had a chance to meet this year, who is very nice.
Yeah. So Face finds Fanon, and they're able to talk. Fanon's so injured he can't stand, so he's being essentially pulled along on a broken speeder bike, as you see there. And even in the run-up to that fateful mission, like the night before, Fanon is talking to Face about how he sees there's no future left for him. And kind of the backstory for Fanon from Wraith Squadron is at the Battle of Endor, he was a doctor on one of the medical ships, and
I thought he was on Home 1.
I think he was on a Nebula B. Takes the hit. And I could be wrong, but I remember that off Wedge's they're going for the medical frigate line and wondering if that was the same frigate or medical ship that Fanon would have been on. Let me search the book real quick. Yeah, he says that there was a frigate he was working on, got hit by a barrage. But as a result of that, Fanon lost half his face, had a mechanical leg, and with his back to allergy or inability to use Bacta, anytime he got injured, he'd lose more and more, and no one looked at him, especially not women, as having a future. Yeah, back to allergy. And so you can tell from that passage before the mission, he's really not doing well, and drinking heavily. Face even tries to tell him, if you're not up for the mission, let me know and we'll deal with it. But he goes and he dies. And Face then has to leave and rejoin the unit. And that really sets up, with this in particular, Face as a leader, which kind of been pushed into that role because he was the actor and he could play General Kargan better than anyone. And it wouldn't make sense for the general of the pirate group to be taking orders from somebody else, like Wedge, even though he's more experienced. So that is kind of the fallout of the double play. And then when Face is talking to Wedge, he finds out, given Fenan's parents being significantly older and having died, he doesn't have any actual relatives that he knew personally. Face is the sole recipient and next of kin according to his will.
And this is also important because Face's arc is kind of, it's not in the foreground like Kel's arc is. You only really get 2 scenes where you see Face's arc play out. One is when Fanon is dying and he tells Face to stop punishing himself for helping the Empire as a little boy. And he says a very key line that you cannot reduce sapient lives to numbers and exchange them like credits, which is what Face is trying to do. He's trying to save enough lives so that he makes up for the lives that the Empire destroyed with the money and recruitment that his movies caused. And for a lot of the time, we mostly see Face acting functionally because he doesn't dwell on his problems the way that Kel does. But Allston is the master of having things underneath the surface. As we saw the last book, there's a very deep arc that goes on for Tyria, but you don't really see it. You can just imply it from a couple things she says. But then I want to take a break from the Face plot and talk about our new pilot, Lara Notzel. So in Wraith Squadron, you basically had one main character arc, which is Kel's, and then you had lots of pieces of arcs of Min and Wedge and Wes and Jesmyn. Like, all these characters had little arcs, but it was mostly just Kel's novel. This book, I would argue, has 2 main arcs, and the second is Lara's. And Lara actually only has kind of the middle of the book, and it overlaps. So as Wraith said, it starts out with Lara trying to get back to Zinj from Coruscant. And she doesn't have money, and she doesn't have the ability to reach Zinj directly, but she does have the skills to create a job and live there until she can hear back from Zinj. While she's doing that, Tan recruits Face and Kel to try and get back at the corrupt colonel who ruined Tyria's life in the first book. Colonel Repness, we found out here. He was not named in the first book. And so Lara is recruited to do badly as a New Republic fighter pilot and attract the notice of Colonel Repness. And then she's supposed to call Face and Fanon in to expose him. But because she is a fully trained Imperial Intelligence operative, she decides to take him down by herself. She hacks into his computer, steals and corrupts his equipment, records all of his passwords and all of his file manipulations, puts it on an anonymous letter, and sends it to General Crespin, the leader of the base. And unfortunately, she's not... What?
Sorry, does she send it to Crespin or Kraken?
I think it's Crespin, because he's the leader of the Tedivium's training frigate.
Oh, I thought he took that over after Repness got placed.
Well, Repness is just the commander of the remedial unit. I don't think he's the commander of the entire training program. Because he's just a colonel. So at most, he would have control of 1 squadron. At least in the New Republic scheme of things. I don't know what real colonels do. Anyway, she's not able to beat Repness physically, and so Repness punches her and then kicks her in the head, and then he plans to get her committed as an insane person, but she beat him to the punch and got him caught.
And it sets up one of my favorite lines of the book.
Which one?
I'll address you as Colonel Bantha Sweat and show you whatever I want.
Well, first Repness says, "You'll address me as Colonel Repness and treat me with respect." And then she responds with that, as he deserves. She then joins... So she is able to lie to the New Republic trainers and say that as a farm girl, she had a lot of hang-ups because Triget destroyed her world, and so she vapes an accelerated training course and demonstrates enough piloting skill and technical competence to be a member of either Wraith or Rogue Squadron, which is really impressive because Rogue Squadron is supposed to be like the Blue Angels, top of the line, top of the top squadron in the entire New Republic Armed Forces. So the fact that she is a good enough pilot to be in that squadron is really impressive. So Wedge decides to assign her to Wraith Squadron because General Crespin gives her Colonel Repnis's X-Wing and Astromech. And the Astromech is named Tonin, which is Aldevan, which is the farm world that Lara is supposed to be from, for Little Aten. So it's supposed to be a joke about Aten Repnis. Now, as Wraith Squadron, the Wraiths take a break from being pirates and join the Mon Ramonda for a strike against a world that Zinj is pretending is already his, but isn't. And Lara realizes that Zinj is willing to sacrifice Imperial lives who they weren't aggressive, they weren't getting in the way of the New Republic. He was going to pretend that they were already his allies and use the Mon Ramonda to hurt the world so that they would have to ally with Zinj. And she decides that that is dishonorable. And her entire arc so far, first with Admiral Triget, and second with Aten Repnis, is learning that she cares about having integrity, keeping her word, and having honor, having an internal sense that she is doing the right thing, the best thing that she can. And that Zinj and Triget and Repnis are not doing the right thing, and therefore she does not owe them respect or allegiance. And so this first battle that she's in is a huge emotional and psychological turning point where she realizes that she has been fighting for an empire which is built on evil practices, even though there are plenty of people in the empire who may not be wholly evil, who are trying to do the best they can. The empire deliberately twists people, and she thinks about Imperial pilots who are kept on a barely honed edge of ferocity that is supposed to make them better warriors, but also makes them terrible, husbands and wives because they have domestic violence because they're too violent all the time. And so she realizes that she's on the wrong side.
There's also a bit where, she's been told similar things about New Republic pilots, and they, there's a lot of camaraderie there. And before that battle even kicks off, she's in place behind Wedge and also Face, and thinks, they're right there in front of me. Their shields are down. I can kill them both and contact the Imperials and say, hey, I'm coming in. But then it occurs to her, shooting them in the back like that would be dishonorable, even though she's not supposed to think about honor in any sense as a part of her training.
Only efficiency for Imperial intelligence operatives.
And there's a bit where, with how those lives were being thrown away, so she's kind of set up to listen into their communications and doesn't think to turn that off when the battle starts, and hears one of them die. And that affects her too.
It's kind of horrifying, even though it's also very exciting. And then after she makes this decision to be Lara Notzel and try to join the New Republic for real, not just as a ploy, she gets a letter from Aldevi, her cover identity's home, and her cover identity's brother. But she realizes that it's actually Zinj. And she's extremely upset because she doesn't want to work for Zinj anymore. But Zinj, of course, could betray her and let the New Republic know that she's actually Garrett Petterthal. So she meets Min Donos, who's practicing sniping, and he notices she's upset, and she tells him the story. And Donos is like, what if it's a Zinj plan? And Lara's like, it's definitely a Zinj plan, but she can't tell him that. So Min, as a lieutenant who has a leadership position in the squadron, goes to Wedge and proposes that he guard Lara on a mission to meet her brother in case it is a trap. So they go to Aldivie, and it is a trap, of course, and Min doesn't know what's happening because she makes him stay about a mile away, but she signals him, and he snipes the two people who are about to attack her, and she's able to keep her cover identity and stay in the squadron. And that ends her arc in the book. She actually doesn't have any more perspective after that mission.
Although
But it is... What?
I was just going to mention there was a point after she gets the letter where, and it goes into great detail about this, she doesn't even know who she is. She's specifically wondering, wait, am I Lara Natso? Am I Gara Pedithal? I don't know who I am anymore on a literal, like, what's my name level, because that's the level of Imperial intelligence training.
Yeah, well, Imperial intelligence training is clearly extremely brutal and psychologically unhealthy. They do not care about their agents at all. They only care about their efficiency, and that results in people who are barely functional as real people. They're very functional as intelligence gathering widgets and assassination devices, but they're not people anymore. So Lara is slowly rediscovering how to be human. And one of these things she remembers, which isn't important now, but will be important in the next book, is that one of her first cover identities was a seemingly carefree woman named Kearney Slane. So remember that name for next book.
And I mean, of course, it's also set up that her parents were intelligence operatives, and because they, done something that annoyed the wrong person,
the ISARDs.
Yeah, they executed, and then she went into Imperial intelligence herself anyway.
And she was about 10 or so when they were executed, and probably not much older when she was recruited into intelligence.
Yeah.
So why don't you pick us up and take us to the end with Face's plot?
Yeah. So Face's plot. Then with having been recruited by Zinj, they being the Hawkbats, get invited to meet with him in person. Both Zinj and his second in command, General Melvar, who, and I never really thought about this as I hadn't read this, was also originally from Courtship of Princess Leia, and gets a lot of, I presume, expansion beyond that role as well. So he's kind of funny because he's, the guy that can tell Zinj, exactly how things are without having to worry about being reprimanded or executed, potentially, which wouldn't really be the case with a lot of other warlords in the Star Wars book. But they get invited to meet with Zinj and Far aboard the Iron Fist to discuss how it can work, some testing. No, that part comes later. So what happens, Kel is, posing as the hand guy and mentions as a throwaway that, well, yeah, I'm good, but I have somebody even better, and he's referring to Shala, in the hope that they can bring her in as somebody who works for Zinj as well. More on that later. So they're meeting with Zinj and talking to him and Melvar. The Kargan voice is really good here, and Melvar's voice, as done by Thompson, sounds a lot like Scar from the original Lion King movie. So that's now how I see him sneaking up behind Zinj at any point. But while everything has gone great, then trouble emerges because Caston, the slicer, had been convinced, well, I'm the best there is. I can come up with this program and plant it in the Iron Fist computer that'll tip us off to their location at any point in time so that we can track them. And he takes that to Wedge, who is like, well, you don't even know who Zinj's slicer is, so how can you say that you're better than him? Then in the meeting before the Iron Fist mission, Caston brings up, like, well, let me go on this mission. And he challenges Wedge over that in front of everyone else, and then really gets scolded there. But despite being ordered not to, he sneaks his way onto the shuttle that's going to the Iron Fist through some Ferris Bueller's Day Off type methods, and thinks, I'm going to do it. Wedge is wrong, and I'm right. And this is all going to go great. But in the process of attempting that, sets off a tripwire that he hadn't thought of. So he's got stormtroopers after him, and while he's trying to get away, comes across a hidden lab aboard Iron Fist with non-humans being experimented on. And despite how he'd been before, which is why I brought it up, that really gets to him, and he frees them. Some of the non-humans, specifically a Tau's, usually a gentle creature, not sure how to describe them, but they're tall and kind of abominable snowman-esque without being wampas.
I was about to mention abominable snowman.
And so he frees the Tau's, even though that's making the scientists panic because they know they're going to get attacked for what they've been doing. Because they're specifically trying to make this gentle alien really aggressive. But Caston, he's in, over his head. There's too many stormtroopers after him. He's already been shot once, and he realizes he's not going to make it. So he shoots his data pad, and then the scene cuts off there. And you don't really know what's happened to him until back at the dinner with Melvar and Zinj aboard Iron Fist. Suddenly, Zinj says, we've had kind of an internal issue. Wondering if you could clear it up for us. And a pair of stormtroopers come in, breathing with Caston seemingly unconscious, body between them. So Zinj, is rightly suspicious that this attempted saboteur guy is from the Hawkbats group. And so he challenges them to kill this man for him. Face is trying to talk his way out of it as, we don't take human life without sufficient financial reason to do so, which is kind of noble, but also not. And then Dia is like, well, he's just saying what he has to under her pirate articles of Confederation. But I can do it. And Face and Kel, who were there, are thinking, she's got a plan to get us all out of this, even though they're in, the dining room of a Super Star Destroyer. But then her plan is to just shoot Caston herself. And
it's a really shocking scene because I couldn't think of a way out of it, and Dia just goes up and shoots him in the throat.
Yeah. Although Zinj, assuming he's dealing with actual pirates, a bit surprised he doesn't put it past them that they would kill one of their own in that sort of situation, especially if the guy had messed up and was putting them all at risk. But that convinces them, and he thinks, oh, this saboteur must have been from another pirate group that I've had aboard the ship. So they leave in the shuttle, and seemingly everything is fine until Dia suddenly has a breakdown over the fact that she shot Caston, and she's convinced he was dead and that they had a mechanical pump making it look like he was still breathing. But even if he was dead and she shot him, she still can't bear that. And so this really brings up kind of the cracks in her facade of being, the bloodthirsty former slave Twi'lek who is, set on getting revenge. And she even tries to shoot herself, but Face stops her from being able to do that. I mean, to the point that his finger is what's keeping the trigger from being depressed all the way. And so that got pretty heavy, especially listening to it in the audiobook with Thompson.
It's insanely heavy because Dia, you never get a perspective from her, but she's so vivid in her personality that seeing her stripped down and then try and kill herself is so powerful. And Allston writes it so well. Like, Allston gets a lot of praise, justifiably, for the death of Ton Fanon because it's so well written and it's so thematically deep. But I would argue this is just as deep and just as powerful.
Yeah, the thing that I guess makes it stand out is we've had a whole book and a half to get to know Fanon before that. Whereas here, Dia's new and Dia's never had the point of view.
And Caston's new, too.
We talked about it. Yeah, Caston's also new, but...
Although we do get a whole, we get a big chunk of his head, and he's kind of a jerk.
Yeah, I mean, he's consistently been insubordinate, but it makes sense somewhat that he was in a rebel group on Coruscant, or there wouldn't be a formal rank structure.
Yeah, and he does have an arc where he starts off he's never been around non-humans, so he's kind of a bigot about them, but then he realizes that it's wrong that what Zinj is doing to the non-humans. So that's a nice arc, even though it doesn't go very far. It's nice to see that even someone who's got these wrong opinions, these wrong values, is able to move past them at least a little bit.
Because, he might have made it survived if he hadn't gone in for the aliens being experimented on.
I mean, I don't think he really would have survived because all those stormtroopers were getting ready to kill him.
Yeah, might have survived is a bit of a stretch when he's on a super Star Destroyer and he shouldn't be, but
yeah. Very tragic. Yeah. 2 deaths in this book, and both of them are pretty gut-wrenching. And then we have this Dia breakdown, which is as powerful as either of them.
And it really shows Face as the leader even more, because it's interesting where he's talking to Wedge about it, because he's thinking, I'm going to have to explain to Wedge how 2 people in my unit have died in my presence in the past week or so. The first being Fanon and then Caston right after. And Wedge kind of shows him that, Caston kind of set this up himself. It's not blameless in his own death because he was going there against orders.
We'll talk about that a little bit more when we analyze the book, because I think that plays into Fanon's death. But yeah, the unit is just in bad shape after these 2 deaths. So what happens to fix that?
Right, it's just hard to keep track of what we're going to talk about later. But what happens next is Runt, Ekwesh, the equine horse-like pilot, essentially dupes Wedge into going along with what he thinks is a Thakwa ritual of, the details aren't explained, but he tells Wedge, I've got something in mind. Have everyone report here at 0800 tomorrow morning. for this ritual. But then it turns out to just be a formal dance where they're all in their dress uniforms. And the fact that it's like 8 a.m. hadn't really occurred to me until I listened to it in the audiobook. And so, yeah, Wedge basically goes along with it because he's like, well, I'm curious what he's going to do. And morale is really low. So they basically, they being Runt and all the astromechs, set up like a simulated outdoor area under the stars, even though they're on a pirate base and don't have that at all. And so I think Kel and Tyria are the first ones to go out and dance, which makes sense since they're an established couple. And, well, Kel had been Runt's wingmate, so he might have an idea of what's going on. He also congratulates Runt on successfully making a human-style joke about this being a compulsory dance, so if anyone doesn't do it, we'll shoot them. Do we want to talk more about who's dancing with who here, or save that for later? I think later would work well.
I mean, there's only really 3 couples that are important, I would say. The first,
well, I think it'd go in with the romances.
Well, you do need to talk about the Face and Dia one now, though.
Okay, I wasn't sure if we were going into that.
Well, it's part of the
now
plot.
Or the romances in the after action part. But yeah, so in the course of the dancing, and there's a funny bit where Wes, who being the second most experienced pilot in the unit, is paired up with Dia as his wingmate. Because, yeah, Wedge's protocol is to get the most inexperienced people, have them on the wing of the most experienced ones. So when Caston had been assigned as Wedge's wingmate, he was like thinking that was impressive, not realizing it was the exact opposite. But Wes and Dia are wingmates, and there's a scene where they go out next because Wes asks, hey, let's go, and she admits she doesn't know how to dance because, as a dancer, she was dancing for others, not with them. So they start to learn, but then suddenly, as they're kind of like spinning around, Dia feels an extra pair of hands intertwined with hers, and Wes has passed her to Face. No, it was the other way around. So Lara is dancing with Face and talking to him at the same time about Fanon's death. And then she spins him around to suddenly be dancing with Dia, where neither one of them were expecting it. Because she and Wes had that plan in mind to each start dancing with the other one and then bring them together. Because Dia had told Wes something about how she wanted to talk to Face, but she didn't know how. So essentially they set that up in a very, I find it easy to imagine in my head reading it, although I'm probably not doing a good job describing it. But yeah, so that has Face and Dia together, and she admits that, with what Face did to keep her from killing herself, and the aftermath of that, she ended up feeling safe for the first time in a long time. And that ends up leading to, they get together, they kiss. Goes on from there, and they end up dating Is that enough of a description of the romance on their end?
I mean, that's what happens.
Yeah.
And
So
then
then
what?
they get in for what Wedge correctly predicts is, and this was a funny scene, a mission to steal a super star destroyer.
Although technically, Face predicted it first, way back at the beginning of the book.
True. But then, well, there's a funny scene where Wedge is like, oh, I think I know what Zinja's up to. And he writes it down on a piece of paper before they get confirmation of what Zinja's up to. Because essentially Zinj doesn't want to tell them what he's doing because he doesn't fully trust these pirates. So he gives them information on expected enemy strength that is easily translated to the New Republic military guarding Coruscant, because they know it's going to be a space battle and an advanced infiltration. But really, if you take all the data that leads them to think it's Coruscant and you go deeper, you can find out that it's the Super Star Destroyer secretly under construction at Kuwait. Even though they don't know that there is one, they're guessing. So it's an interesting situation where it's bad for the New Republic, whether the Imperials have another Super Star Destroyer or Zinj. So they're going to help him steal it and then ambush him once he's jumped it away to somewhere nearby. So you get a really elaborate plot line where half the Wraiths are going sent in either as the pirates for Zinj or his advanced team, getting aboard the Super Star Destroyer Razor's Kiss, and then the other half are waiting in reserve for when the New Republic ambushes. So this is where you have Shala as yet another hand-to-hand and infiltration expert sent into Zinj's employ, and she gets tested because Khaled made the grandiose claim that she could kill a Wookiee barehanded without any weapons. And so they want to see if that's true, and there's a simulated combat exercise between her and the main hand-to-hand combat guy for Zinj's forces. It starts off with her breaking his nose with a data pad because she realized his handshake was really the setup to try to gain leverage. So that's to say, she goes on this infiltration mission posing as Zinj's group. And
an interesting piece here is, like Lara hears her trainers, Shala hears her father, who was her trainer, as she's on this mission, which really brings out, this is something I hadn't realized till this read through. I've read this book probably 10 times. And this time, I think the big insights I had were Face's journey and Shala's parallel with Lara. And those were really cool insights.
Yeah, Shala's a really good foil for Lara. And so I don't want to explain everything she does, but
mostly she hits people.
Yeah. There'd been a scene earlier where she accidentally, I don't think it's in this, I think it's before, where she shoots somebody and then realizes
that was the first mission on that,
and is regretful that she killed somebody needlessly because she'd been careless. But here she goes in, helps Zinj's people get control of the Super Star Destroyer and start flying it away. Meanwhile, Wedge, and this is an interesting bit, is so at the end of Wraith Squadron, it's revealed that Fel is in with Zinj now. And so Wedge, being his brother-in-law, is this would take a long time to explain, but essentially he's posing as an Ewok pilot in the pirate group. And So he's flying all dressed in black, so he isn't visible, with an Ewok strapped to his chest, holding the controls, and is having to, in Ewok speak.
So how much you want to bet that Jansen's the one who persuaded Kasten to make Wedge's voice an Ewok?
I'm not betting against that at all.
Not a question. That's definitely what happened.
So what happened, quick version is, Kasten gives everybody a voice changer for when they're the pirates, and he makes Wedge sound like the Ewok. But then one of those recordings gets intercepted by Zinj. So he's wanting to know, when they're all at dinner, do you have an Ewok in your pilot? And Face scrambles to answer by giving him the backstory of Vord and making it about an Ewok, which in turn makes Zinj and Melvar panic, because they think this could have been one of their alien experiments escaped and they don't know about it. So Wedge is trying to talk to Fel about what's going on with his sister without being too obvious about it in the run-up before the battle. Doesn't really get a conclusive answer, other than that Fel, who used to fly with Wedge, now thinks Wedge can't fly worth a damn. So in the course of the battle, I don't want to go over everything, but Shala and Vort managed to damage the shields on both Superstar Destroyers, and yeah, the Razor's Kiss ends up getting destroyed by the New Republic, blown to pieces, but the Iron Fist gets away, and the New Republic task force takes a lot of damage themselves and has to withdraw. So they won in denying Zinj a second Super Star Destroyer that would have made him a huge threat, but it was somewhat costly for them as well, even if all the Wraiths survived that battle.
But one of them nearly doesn't.
Yes. Well, I mean, what Shala and Fort had both done was essentially crash land their ties.
No, I was talking about Face.
Oh, right. I'll get to that. Yeah, so they essentially crash landed their ties on the Superstar Destroyers before they jump to hyperspace, which means they only have so much air available. And if they run out, they're dead. But yeah, in the course of the battle, Face's X-Wing is heavily damaged. And to the point that he thinks, I'm not going to make it. And he forgets that he's Wraith 8. To where they're, talking about 8, and he's thinking, man, 8's in trouble, without realizing, wait, I'm 8. And so it's pretty far into all that. But they managed to recover his fighter.
Well, first, he's trying to ram into the Iron Fist to finally make up for his sins as a little boy. And he remembers what Fanon told him. And that's a very moving scene where he decides, my life is worth living.
Yeah, that part eluded me for a moment there. But yeah, he has that moment of realization and managed to recover him. They have to pick apart some pieces of him from the X-Wing. But since he can use Bacta, he makes a full recovery, and it's revealed at the end, in keeping with the terms of Fanon's will, has undergone surgery to remove the scar across his face from when he was present at a shootout between the rebels that had kidnapped him and the Imperial Commando team trying to rescue him, and he got a blaster burn across the face. So, yeah, he's had that secretly removed and was wearing a fake scar so that he didn't have to tell everyone else he'd had it removed. And then there's a funny scene at the very end where, Dia and his now girlfriend somehow she's got her hand on his face, and then she realizes, wait, what's this? And starts tugging at the fake scar. And so the ending lines are, her saying to friends who don't try to hide, conceal what they've done or something like that, even though she's revealed that despite her initial plans when Fanon and Faye first meet her, that she's never seen any of Face's holodramas she actually had, because she let slip that he looks, without the scar, he looks almost as young as he did in one of them. And so she's saying, to the friends who don't lie about these things, referring to the scar, having dropped it into Face's mouth. And so he pulls it out and it's like, Dia, you're in Wraith Squadron. You're never going to get that. And that concludes the book.
Yeah, this is a lot of people's favorite X-Wing book because it has that Fanon scene, and it also just has so many intense scenes, and is really beautifully structured with this sort of 3 acts where you've got your climax of the pirates, and then your climax with Lara, and then your climax with Face, and each of them builds to each other, and they're really well overlapped.
Personally, I go Solo Command.
I'm also a Solo Command guy, but I think we'd have to be fair and say that in the fandom, a ton of people would.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing there. I was just going to mention that for this month, I only listened to the audiobook and didn't reread the book. And I'm not being a big audiobook listener, so my memory from just that was a little shakier than usual.
That's interesting, because I also actually only re-listened to not re-listened, it was the first time, but I listened to the audiobook, and it was powerful. I'm so glad that we had these. We'll talk more about the audiobook later, but if you've got an Audible membership, put the Wraith Squadron books on your list. Get them; they are worth it. But let's talk about our favorite parts. So we've hinted at a lot of favorite parts, but if you had to pick 2 moments from this book, what would your favorites be? I know.
Not a question in the show notes, so I did not have. I mean, I can't say all of Lara's arc.
Pick a part of Lara's arc.
The sticking it to Repness.
Yes, that's a great part. That line was amazing.
And then my second one, a conversation between Fel and Wedge's catch, but I can't explain why in full now.
That was great. And you were mentioning, in the show notes you wrote that it's a good thing to talk about how in the comics at the time, as we've talked about, Baron Fel was part of Rogue Squadron. Now, obviously, that took place 2 years before these books, but there were readers who were reading both the X-Wing comics and the books at the time, and they wrote letters to the comics saying, "What happened to Fel? Why is he evil in the books now?" And, of course, Mike Stackpole knew what was going on, and so he and the editors said, "Keep reading the Wraith books. It all makes sense." And I'll tell you now, if you read Solo Command, it does all make sense when you read it all. My personal favorites are definitely the 2 favorites. I think I would say are when Lara has the thought, Zinj is the same as Trigget. And that's just such a powerful point where she realizes her entire world has to be flipped upside down. And then Face, when he's basically melted into his cockpit by a laser blast, and he realizes his life is worth living because Fanon said you can't reduce sapient lives to numbers and exchange them like credits. And I think too many people feel this way. Too many people feel like you can take people and add them up and subtract them, but we have to be more personal. We have to live a life of connection to people, not a life of quantification of people. And I think that's a really good lesson that Allston is able to get through in this powerful scene of Face realizing that he has to live his life. When did you first read this book?
I was reading. I don't remember the exact year, obviously. Probably 2000, maybe. I mean, I was at the point where once I was old enough, I was reading, all the Rogue Squadron comics and then the X-Wing books, since they were all published and out at the library in chronological order.
And what do you remember about when you first read it? Did it stick out to you at the time, or?
Well, at the time I was 8, so I mean, yeah, it's hard for me to answer that one, but
yeah, I was 12 when I read this in 1998, and I remember just loving the book because it's twisty, it's got pirate action, it's got starfighter action, it's got romance, it's got tons of skullduggery, and some people say this is so wacky, and it is wacky. The Wraiths dress up as pirates and an Ewok and fool a man with a super starter. That is silly if that's how you describe it, but every step of it makes perfect sense as you go along with it. And I just love it. I think it's a really great book, and it really, I would say, is better than Wraith Squadron, even though Wraith Squadron's a significant number of pages longer. In the new edition, Wraith Squadron ends on page 417, and Iron Fist ends on page 335. So it's nearly 100 pages longer. But I think that's really because Allston wasn't able to edit Wraith Squadron the way he would have wanted to. And he was able to really focus. He knew his characters more, he knew his themes and his arcs better, and he had a better plan of the whole arc. So Iron Fist really is much more efficient. I mean, we're talking about Imperial intelligence being efficient, but it's good when a book is efficient because it's able to pack a ton of stuff into a smaller number of scenes, and you get the same rich and deep experience with the characters and the same exciting action. I would say that the set pieces are probably a bit better. I mean, you get great things like M2398 in Wraith Squadron, and of course the final battle with the Implacable. But there's a bunch of commando missions in the middle of Wraith Squadron that sometimes blur together. So I would say that Iron Fist is more efficient and more polished than Wraith Squadron, and is definitely a really great book. And
I mean, the scene with Face and Fanon is, incredibly memorable. It made that top 20 list for a reason.
Yeah,
even though
people still remember it on Twitter and on podcasts and everywhere.
Fanon, he's a character who he'd only been in a book and a half, and it got on there along with the deaths of, I won't say who, but some very significant in terms of number of books characters.
So speaking of Tom Fanon's death, we already showed the great illustration by Joe Caroni, although eagle-eyed book fans who know the image will also know that Face should be wearing crazy makeup, and there's a couple other details that
shouldn't have an Imperial patch on his shoulder.
Fanon should be on the speeder bike, all the little details, but it still works perfectly, I think. But talk to us a bit about what Allston said about Fanon's death. He posted on his website, and he also repeated this on some podcasts.
Yeah, so sadly, Allston's website is only available through kind of the Internet Archive, and I didn't even know about it until maybe a year ago but there's a section. So he has some general questions that he answers, and then specifically about the 3 Wraith novels, and then he'll answer ones about each one of the 3. And so the single question that I guess people have asked about Iron Fist is, why did Tom Finnan have to die? And so he talks about, this is war and people are going to die, and they're going to be people that the reader knows and has gotten used to. It can't just be the minor players. Originally, Allston planned to have him die in Wraith Squadron itself in place of Jesmond Akbar, but that didn't really work narratively, so he put Jesmond in. And so then he's, thinking is, there had to be more to that moment as far as what Fanon said and what led to it and how it influenced Face. And so just to quote directly, it says, in essence, Tan and Face had something very important in common. They'd both been so badly damaged by their experiences that they didn't have much of a future to look forward to. The difference between them was that Tan couldn't come back from what had damaged him, and Face could. Tan realized this, though Face did not. In dying, Tan was able to give Face some thoughts and words, and one symbol of the restoration of his face that could set Face on the path toward the recovery. And he also notes that ultimately Fanon didn't want to live deep down, and that made it inevitable in the course of the novels.
And I think it's really interesting to think about the idea that Allston definitely thought deeply and felt deeply. He would often say, if you were crying when reading a scene, I was probably crying when writing the scene. I think that definitely was the case here. And I would say probably also when he was writing Dia's breakdown and even Kastan's death. But I think if we think about the characters who die in these 2 books, in Wraith Squadron, you have Jesmond, Grinder, and Phelan, and then in this book you have Fanon and Kastan. Jesmond, I think, is supposed to be an accidental death. She doesn't want to die, but what happens to her is just bad luck. Her inertial competitor gets shot, and so she can't stay conscious to get free. Grinder doesn't make connections with the rest of the squadron, so he's not sticking with people, and so he's by himself, and I think that's part of why he dies. And again, some of this is accidental, but I think that is part of his story.
I did think, he chose to follow Phelan in there.
Yeah. And then Phelan, of course, was driven by her own sense of self-worthlessness, because she felt like she was always second best and no one really cared enough to know about her. And so she was driven to fly into a Star Destroyer until she couldn't get back out. I mean, it's kind of a classic, monkey's paw. You stick your hand in and you refuse to let go, and that's what traps you. And I think that Phelan had that, even though she was a really fascinating and intense and cool character that I would have liked to see more of. But I can definitely see what Allston was thinking with her character. And of course, we've already talked about Tan through Allston. And Kastan, too, he was a character who felt this enormous guilt for unintentionally causing the deaths of this young mother and all these people on the plaza. And he was so driven that he was reckless and arrogant in his drive to destroy Zinj, and that destroyed him instead, even though he was able to see more redemptive purpose in other lives that he previously had dismissed. So let's talk a little bit about our romances. We have the continuation of Kel and Tyria's romance from the first book, and you don't really get a lot of perspective from either of them, but there's always a connection between them. They're always concerned about each other and enjoying each other, and Kel and Tyria are the first people to dance at the ball. And so if you like their romance, as I do, I think it's very sweet to see them continue in this book.
Yeah, I mean, narratively he'd done what Allston had done, kind of what needed to be done as far as setting them up. So they're just in the background, but it's good to see that it lasts and goes on.
And then we have Face and Dia. How do you feel about this romance?
It kind of comes up rather abruptly out of kind of the traumatic experiences for both of them. But it makes sense at the time.
Yeah, I think it's
especially
interesting.
with people dying around them. And
I think it's interesting. They continue, obviously, for a little bit, but it's interesting to think about their arc. I think definitely when we get to Mercy Kill, and probably earlier if I can persuade Wraith to do the New Jedi Order with me, we'll talk about the fact that Allston actually had a very specific thought in mind for this couple, even though he ultimately did something different with it, which is kind of fun. I do agree it's a little bit, I wouldn't say out of nowhere, because their bonding experience in the mission to Iron Fist is intense. He is able to convince her that she is safe, and that is something she hasn't felt since she was stolen and sold into slavery as a little girl. And so I think that is powerful, but I do think it is quick. And the thing is, when you're in these kinds of pressure cooker situations in wartime, these kind of romances are real. You see these things in historical accounts of war and so forth. So it does make sense. It doesn't necessarily make sense that they would be romances for all time. We also have Wedge's arc, where he really struggles with the fact that he doesn't have anyone in his personal life. Like, his whole life is basically consumed by being a fighter pilot and fighter squadron commander.
Is this the one where he sees Kel and Tyria?
Yep.
And gets, okay, I thought that was in Wraith Squadron, so I didn't talk about it in terms of that. Okay, that makes more sense. Yeah. And it makes sense for something that comes up in Solo Command.
Well, and I would argue it's part of his overall arc that leads to Starfighters of Adumar.
Yeah, definitely.
Wedge doesn't have what I'd say is an overall arc in the Wraith Squadron books. He's more of a major supporting character. He doesn't grow or develop. He's kind of the person who makes it happen, but it's not his story. But it leads to Starfighters of Adumar, which is 100% and only Wedge's story.
Yeah, I mean, it's entirely his point of view. Even.
Yeah, you could have written that book in first person, but I'm kind of glad that you didn't, because I prefer the sense that you can get outside of Wedge's point of view, even though it's entirely from that point of view. First person is different, as I hope we'll talk about when we do iJedi at some point. We have the continuation of Ketch, which I was not expecting. I mean, it was basically one joke at the beginning of Wraith Squadron, but it becomes really big in this book.
Yeah, it's all because of that voice changer.
Well, and the fact that Jansen, well, we don't know that. I just spoiled it. But someone bought a Ketch stuffed toy and started hiding it in various simulators across the base.
I mean, who else could that have been? Jansen,
I mean, it's definitely
made it up in the first place and told it to Wedge. I don't even think anyone else knew about it besides the two of them.
Yeah, although you could argue that maybe Wes could have put Fanon or Face up to do it, because they definitely would have, but he's definitely the one who would have done it.
Yeah. And you'll get even more Ketch in the next book. Unsurprisingly.
Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about our two covers. So we have the original cover by Paul Ewell, which is that it's interesting because it's primarily blue. The X-Wing books have mostly been in space, although Wraith Squadron had the explosion behind the Lambda shuttle that made it mostly orange. But Iron Fist is the blue X-Wing book, and it's kind of just cool and unique. It also is cool and unique in that it has no X-Wings on the front. It's only these TIE interceptors and TIE fighters. What do you think about the original cover?
I definitely, I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing for the new ones, but I definitely, the originals are what I'm used to. So definitely the one I prefer. And specifically for Iron Fist, that even made a bit of a comeback in Star Wars material of sorts, if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, actually, I found out from our friend on the Star Wars Expanded Universe Discord server that the instruction manual for the new TIE Interceptor Ultimate Collector series has the image from Iron Fist, and that's actually why I chose to buy that, and I built it while listening to the audiobook. So I highly recommend, if you have any Star Wars Legos, but particularly the Interceptor, to build Legos while listening to the audiobooks. It's a great experience. And then we have our new image, which we've already talked about. It's Tyria Sarkin and Vort Sabingrin, called Piggy, along with a silhouette of a Star Destroyer and TIE fighters. I think it's very nice. It's very pretty. It's very mid-2020s. This is a style of cover that is extremely popular right now. It's semi-minimalist, but more detailed than, say, the Legacy. Sorry, not the Legacy. The Fate of the Jedi series, which was monochromatic pictures, and it had a very washed out look. So this is much more detailed, even though it has high contrast lighting. So I don't know. I like the new covers. I'm very pleased that they're commissioning new covers for these books that make them feel fresh and modern. I do kind of wish that they included, like, as a frontispiece, like an illustration of the original cover as well, because I just love those originals and think that they also are really good images. Now, let's talk about our audiobooks. So originally, this was recorded as a 3-hour abridgment read by actor Anthony Heald, who read most of the Expanded Universe in the 90s as these 3-hour abridgments. All the 3-hour abridgments had full sound effects and full music, and Anthony Heald, at least, did a lot of different voices, and he would do a great 3PO voice for Squeaky, and he'd do a good job with Piggy. I actually kind of prefer Heald's Piggy to Marc Thompson's Piggy because it's a little more legible. It's kind of hard to tell what Thompson is saying sometimes because of the mix.
Yeah.
But you can't compete with the full, 14 hours of Iron Fist read by Marc Thompson. So there's a lot of stuff that gets cut out when you cut 11 hours from a book.
Yeah, I mean, I tried to listen to the original abridged Wraith Squadron audiobook to see how a specific character's name was pronounced, and then realized said character was not in the abridged audiobook at all.
Yep, they cut out a lot. Just try listening to Vision of the Future, where they cut out literally 95% of Luke and Mara's story.
No, I don't think I will.
It's insane. I got it and I listened to it and I don't regret it, but wow, that was an experience, man.
At least it was a quick experience.
It was a quick experience. So that,
I'm guessing that means you didn't get to hear their version of Child of Winds either.
No, they do have Child of Winds. They have
Little
that
tangent for the people who've read that.
And I actually think it's a little better because I think Thompson overdoes the squeaking part of the aliens in Vision of the Future. But the Iron Fist audiobook is really good, with one small flaw, which is that somehow in the new setting of the text, Lara's astromech, called Tonin, is misprinted as Tonio. And Marc Thompson got the new text and read Tonio several times, and I was very confused.
Yeah, that's hopefully not repeated in the next book.
Well, we've talked to the editor, as we said, and mentioned that there was this typo. So hopefully he'll be able to catch that for Solo Command, if it happened. There's some other fun voices. We've already mentioned Face's pirate impression, but Face himself is kind of a William Shatner impression, which other people pointed out I think is very funny because he's a space captain who is also an actor. Lara's voice is kind of fun because she has kind of a generic American voice, but she overlays it with a tiny bit of Southern accent, which is on purpose because it's mentioned that she has a farm girl accent in the text of the book. So I think it's cool that Thompson deliberately made it a small but distinct piece of accent, but it's not always there, especially when Lara's by herself.
So is that not how she sounds in Wraith Squadron then?
No, she definitely doesn't have the Southern accent in Wraith Squadron.
That is good.
And I'm excited to see what Thompson does with Lara in the third book, because she goes through a lot of changes, especially that final scene. I really want to know what he does. One thing I'm wondering, this is just an opinion thing. So Thompson, based on the text that Allston does, Allston assumed that all Mon Calamari basically sound like Admiral Akbar. So they have that kind of very gravelly voice, kind of watery sounding. And in the new TV shows, we see a lot of Mon Calamari who just kind of talk normally. They sound kind of like this. What do you think of that? Do you feel like having all Mon Calamari sound like Admiral Akbar is too stereotypical, or do you feel like having everyone sound like a normal person just wearing a funny mask is a little low effort?
I think they should sound like him because, I mean,
Admiral Akbar is the coolest.
In Rogue One sounded like him too.
That's true.
And plus, like an alien who's, set up like that is probably not going to sound like a human.
Well, this is our opinion. Clearly, Disney has a different idea. That is, I think, most of my thoughts. Do you have any final thoughts before we move to Wing Books on Iron Fist?
Not without spoiling the next book in the series.
I know, there's so much that... This book, by the way, and Wraith Squadron 2 both have so many layers that when you build over them multiple times in Solo Command, it just has so much more meaning and so much more emotional impact. So in November, when we do our Solo Command podcast, it's going to be amazing. All right, let's move to our section on Wing Books. Again, this is where we recommend books that are good companions to the book that we're reading this week, this month. And mine is a series that also had a new entry this month. So technically Iron Fist isn't new in June, but a new version came out. And so a new book in the series, The Spiral Wars by Joel Shepard, came out, and you can get these on audiobook or on Kindle or on print on demand on Amazon. He's an independent Australian author, and he writes military science fiction in which a single ship, one of basically the equivalent of a Bothan assault carrier or a Endurance class carrier, discovers a horrifying truth about the human military and has to go rogue. So the first book is called Renegade, and he discovers a huge, quiet war that's threatening to engulf the entire Milky Way galaxy. And it is one of the most complex world-building books, but also one of the most intensely human and moral and emotional character series that I've had the pleasure of reading. And that's why I really recommend it this week, because Allston was able to get that amazing world building and wonderful plotting, but also just such a huge focus on the emotions of characters. And I think if you enjoy Aaron Allston's Wraith Squadron and Star Wars books, I think you definitely would enjoy Joel Shepard's military science fiction series.
Yeah, and I read, I don't remember if you mentioned it last month or before that for another Wing Books, the Checkmate comics. Read those, liked those, and now
Would you say I made a good recommendation?
Yes. And
Excellent.
Wedge has read what the overall series for what I'm going to recommend, and now has finished it faster than I could.
Because I'm embarrassingly fast.
So my specifically similar to Iron Fist idea is the novel Starsight from the Skyward series by Brandon Sanderson. It's also, the second in the series, like Iron Fist was, and sees the main character who's a human pilot in a situation where kind of humans, people from Earth, are confined to one world and in a state of constant war with aliens trying to keep them down there, is going undercover among the aliens in a way that feels a lot of similarities to the Hawkbats working for Zinj plotline. And it even has several pirate references in the overall series as well. But I really like it as kind of look at that from one pilot's point of view, and she's young and learning more and more about the war and what war is like. Kind of a somewhat similar journey as Lara, but without, and also Kel and Wraith Squadron, but without the am I on the right side? Do I need to defect for good plotline? Because she's not really a double agent spy.
Yeah, and as Ray says, I read these on his recommendation, and I definitely would also agree. This is a very enjoyable series, and if you like the X-Wing series, definitely has a similar flavor, although it also has a very young adult Brandon Sanderson feel. So if you like that kind of literature, it's up your alley as well.
Ironically, I had not read any of his stuff before this. So it works in that way.
Yeah. So next time, we're not going to be moving directly on to Solo Command, because the final audiobook and final Essential Legends piece of Wraith Squadron comes out this November. So we're going to shoot to do our episode in November. And in the 4 months between now and then, our plan is to listen and read the Rogue Squadron series that kicked it all off, although technically the video game. But the first story was the Rogue Squadron series by Michael Stackpole. And so in July's episode, we will be talking about the first book, Rogue Squadron. So make sure to have read that by the end of the month, and we will release our episode. Also, the next month, in August, that is when the 25th anniversary of Starfighters of Adumar, or Adumar, by Aaron Allston is coming. The 9th book in the X-Wing series. And also, along with Iron Fist, is definitely one of the contenders for people's favorite X-Wing novel. And so we'll be hosting a live stream here on my channel to celebrate it on August 3rd at about 6 to 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. So if you're in another time zone, do the calculation. And we'll hopefully have some amazing guests who, if you are a fan of the expanded universe, Star Wars here on YouTube, you will hopefully recognize one or two of them. And so join us on August 3rd to celebrate one of the best Star Wars books and books in general ever. That brings us to the end of our podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and keep your books locked in reading position.